Chapter 12 of The Bride of Lammermoor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Henry. The Bride of Lammermoor by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 12. Now, dame, quoth he, je vous dis sans doute, had I naught of a capon but the liver, and of your white bread naught but a shiver, and after that a roasted pig's head, but I ne would for me no beast was dead. Then had I with you homely sufferance. Chaucer, Summer's Tale. It was not without some secret misgivings that Caleb set out upon his exploratory expedition. In fact, it was attended with a treble difficulty. He dared not tell his master the offence which he had that morning given to Bucklaw, just for the honour of the family. He dared not acknowledge he had been too hasty in refusing the purse, and thirdly, he was somewhat apprehensive of unpleasant consequences upon his meeting Hayston, under the impression of an affront, and probably by this time under the influence also of no small quantity of brandy. Caleb, to do him justice, was as bold as any lion where the honour of the family of Ravenswood was concerned, but his was that considerate valour which does not delight in unnecessary risks. This, however, was a secondary consideration. The main point was to veil the indigence of the housekeeping at the castle, and to make good his want of the cheer which his resources could procure without Lockhard's assistance, and without supplies from his master. This was as prime a point of honour with him as with the generous elephant with whom we have already compared him, who, being overtasked, broke his skull through the desperate exertions which he made to discharge his duty when he perceived they were bringing up another to his assistance. The village which they now approached had frequently afforded the distressed butler resources upon similar emergencies, but his relations with it had been of late much altered. It was a little hamlet which straggled along the side of a creek formed by the discharge of a small brook into the sea, and was hidden from the castle, to which it had been in former times an appendage, by the intervention of the shoulder of a hill forming a projecting headland. It was called Wolf's Hope, i.e. Wolf's Haven, and the few inhabitants gained a precarious subsistence by manning 2 or 3 fishing boats in the herring season, and smuggling gin and brandy during the winter months. They paid a kind of hereditary respect to the lords of Ravenswood, but in the difficulties of the family most of the inhabitants of Wolf's Hope had contrived to get few rights to their little possessions, their huts, kail-yards, and rights of commonty, so that they were emancipated from the chains of feudal dependence, and free from the various exactions with which, under every possible pretext, or without any pretext at all, the Scottish landlords of the period, themselves in great poverty, were wont to harass their still poorer tenants at will. They might be, on the whole, termed independent, a circumstance peculiarly galling to Caleb, who had been wont to exercise over them the same sweeping authority in levying contributions which was exercised in former times in England, when the royal purveyors, sallying forth from under the Gothic portcullis to purchase provisions with power and prerogative, instead of money, brought home the plunder of 100 markets, and all that could be seized from a flying and hiding country, and deposited their spoil in 100 caverns. Caleb loved the memory and resented the downfall of that authority, which mimicked on a petty scale the grand contributions exacted by the feudal sovereigns, and as he fondly flattered himself that the awful rule and right supremacy, which assigned to the barons of Ravenswood the first and most effective interest in all productions of nature within 5 miles of their castle, only slumbered, and was not departed for ever, he used every now and then to give the recollection of the inhabitants a little jog by some petty exaction. These were at first submitted to, with more or less readiness, by the inhabitants of the hamlet, for they had been so long used to consider the wants of the baron and his family as having a title to be preferred to their own, that their actual independence did not convey to them an immediate sense of freedom. They resembled a man that has been long fettered, who, even at liberty, feels in imagination the grasp of the handcuffs still binding his wrists. But the exercise of freedom is quickly followed with the natural consciousness of its immunities, as the enlarged prisoner, by the free use of his limbs, soon dispels the cramped feeling they had acquired when bound. The inhabitants of Wolf's Hope began to grumble, to resist, and at length positively to refuse compliance with the exactions of Caleb Balderstone. It was in vain he reminded them that when the 11th Lord Ravenswood, called the Skipper, from his delight in naval matters, had encouraged the trade of their port by building the pier, a bulwark of stones rudely piled together, which protected the fishing boats from the weather, it had been matter of understanding that he was to have the first stone of butter after the calving of every cow within the barony, and the first egg, thence called the Monday's egg, laid by every hen on every Monday in the year. The feuars heard and scratched their heads, coughed, sneezed, and being pressed for answer, rejoined with one voice, they could not say, the universal refuge of a Scottish peasant when pressed to admit a claim which his conscience owns, or perhaps his feelings, and his interest inclines him to deny. Caleb, however, furnished the notables of Wolf's Hope with a note of the requisition of butter and eggs, which he claimed as arrears of the aforesaid subsidy, or kindly aid, payable as above mentioned, and having intimated that he would not be averse to compound the same for goods or money, if it was inconvenient for them to pay in kind, left them, as he hoped, to debate the mode of assessing themselves for that purpose. On the contrary, they met with a determined purpose of resisting the exaction, and were only undecided as to the mode of grounding their opposition, when the cooper, a very important person on a fishing station, and one of the conscript fathers of the village, observed, that their hens had cackled mony a day for the Lords of Ravenswood, and it was time they should cackle for those that gave them roosts and barley. A unanimous grin intimated the assent of the assembly. "And," continued the orator, "if it's your will, I'll just tak a step as far as Dunse for Davie Dingwall, the writer, that's come frae the north, to settle amang us, and he'll pitch this job to rights, I'se warrant him." A day was accordingly fixed for holding a grand palaver at Wolf's Hope on the subject of Caleb's requisitions, and he was invited to attend at the hamlet for that purpose. He went with open hands and empty stomach, trusting to fill the one on his master's account, and the other on his own score, at the expense of the feuars of Wolf's Hope. But death to his hopes! As he entered the eastern end of the straggling village, the awful form of Davie Dingwall, a sly, dry, hard-fisted, shrewd country attorney, who had already acted against the family of Ravenswood, and was a principal agent of Sir William Ashton, trotted in at the western extremity, bestriding a leathern portmanteau stuffed with the few charters of the hamlet, and hoping he had not kept Mr. Balderstone waiting, as he was instructed and fully empowered to pay or receive, compound or compensate, and, in fine, to age, as accords, respecting all mutual and unsettled claims whatsoever, belonging or competent to the Honourable Edgar Ravenswood, commonly called the Master of Ravenswood. "The Right Honourable Edgar Lord Ravenswood," said Caleb, with great emphasis, for though conscious he had little chance of advantage in the conflict to ensue, he was resolved not to sacrifice one jot of honour. "Lord Ravenswood, then," said the man of business, "we shall not quarrel with you about titles of courtesy. Commonly called Lord Ravenswood, or Master of Ravenswood, heritable proprietor of the lands and barony of Wolf's Crag, on one part, and to John Whitefish and others, feuars in the town of Wolf's Hope, within the barony aforesaid, on the other part." Caleb was conscious, from sad experience, that he would wage a very different strife with this mercenary champion than with the individual feuars themselves, upon whose old recollections, predilections, and habits of thinking he might have wrought by 100 indirect arguments, to which their deputy representative was totally insensible. The issue of the debate proved the reality of his apprehensions. It was in vain he strained his eloquence and ingenuity, and collected into one mass all arguments arising from antique custom and hereditary respect, from the good deeds done by the Lords of Ravenswood to the community of Wolf's Hope in former days, and from what might be expected from them in future. The writer stuck to the contents of his few charters. He could not see it. 'Twas not in the bond. And when Caleb, determined to try what a little spirit would do, deprecated the consequences of Lord Ravenswood's withdrawing his protection from the borough, and even hinted in his using active measures of resentment, the man of law sneered in his face. His clients, he said, had determined to do the best they could for their own town, and he thought Lord Ravenswood, since he was a lord, might have enough to do to look after his own castle. As to any threats of stouthrift oppression, by rule of thumb, or via facti, as the law termed it, he would have Mr. Balderstone recollect that new times were not as old times, that they lived on the south of the Forth, and far from the Highlands, that his clients thought they were able to protect themselves, but should they find themselves mistaken, they would apply to the government for the protection of a corporal and 4 redcoats, who, said Mr. Dingwall, with a grin, would be perfectly able to secure them against Lord Ravenswood and all that he or his followers could do by the strong hand. If Caleb could have concentrated all the lightnings of aristocracy in his eye to have struck dead this condemner of allegiance and privilege, he would have launched them at his head, without respect to the consequences. As it was, he was compelled to turn his course backward to the castle, and there he remained for full half a day, invisible and inaccessible even to Mysie, sequestered in his own peculiar dungeon, where he sat burnishing a single pewter plate and whistling Maggie Lauder, 6 hours without intermission. The issue of this unfortunate requisition had shut against Caleb all resources which could be derived from Wolf's Hope and its purlieus, the Eldorado, or Peru, from which, in all former cases of exigence, he had been able to extract some assistance. He had, indeed, in a manner, vowed that the deal should have him, if ever he put the print of his foot within its causeway again. He had hitherto kept his word, and, strange to tell, this succession had, as he intended, in some degree, the effect of a punishment upon the refractory feuars. Mr. Balderstone had been a person in their eyes connected with a superior order of beings, whose presence used to grace their little festivities, whose advice they found useful on many occasions, and whose communications gave a sort of credit to their village. The place, they acknowledged, didna look as it used to do, and should do, since Mr. Caleb keepit the castle sae closely. But doubtless, touching the eggs and butter, it was a most unreasonable demand, as Mr. Dingwall had justly made manifest. Thus stood matters betwixt the parties, when the old butler, though it was gall and wormwood to him, found himself obliged either to acknowledge before a strange man of quality, and what was much worse, before that stranger's servant, the total inability of Wolf's Crag to produce a dinner, or he must trust to the compassion of the feuars of Wolf's Hope. It was a dreadful degradation, but necessity was equally imperious and lawless. With these feelings he entered the street of the village. Willing to shake himself from his companion as soon as possible, he directed Mr. Lockhard to Lucky Sma'trash's change house, where a din, proceeding from the revels of Bucklaw, Craigengelt, and their party, sounded half-way down the street, while the red glare from the window overpowered the grey twilight which was now settling down, and glimmered against a parcel of old tubs, kegs, and barrels, piled up in the cooper's yard, on the other side of the way. "If you, Mr. Lockhard," said the old butler to his companion, "will be pleased to step to the change house, where that light comes from, and where, as I judge, they are now singing 'Called Kale in Aberdeen,' you may do your master's errand about the venison, and I will do mine about Bucklaw's bed, as I return frae getting the rest of the vivers. It's no that the venison is actually needfu'," he added, detaining his colleague by the button, "to make up the dinner, but as a compliment to the hunters, ye ken. And, Mr. Lockhard, if they offer ye a drink of yill, or a cup of wine, or a glass of brandy, you'll be a wise man to take it, in case the thunner should hae soured ours at the castle, whilk is our muckle to be dreaded." He then permitted Lockhard to depart, and with foot heavy as lead, and yet far lighter than his heart, stepped on through the unequal street of the straggling village, meditating on whom he ought to make his first attack. It was necessary he should find some one with whom old acknowledged greatness should weigh more than recent independence, and to whom his application might appear an act of high dignity, relenting at once and soothing. But he could not recollect an inhabitant of a mind so constructed. "Our kail is like to be called in Neacht too," he reflected, as the chorus of "Called Kail in Aberdeen" again reached his ears. The minister, he had got his presentation from the late lord, but they had quarrelled about tins. The brewer's wife, she had trusted long, and the bill was aye scored up, and unless the dignity of the family should actually require it, it would be a sin to distress a widow woman. None was so able, but, on the other hand, none was likely to be less willing to stand his friend upon the present occasion than Gibbie Girder, the man of tubs and barrels already mentioned, who had headed the insurrection in the matter of the egg and butter subsidy. "But a' comes o' taking folk on the right side, I trow," quoted Caleb to himself, "and I had ance the ill hap to say he was but a Johnny Newcome in our town, and the carle bore the family an ill will ever since. But he married a bonny young queen, Jean Lightbody, auld Lightbody's daughter, him that was in the steading of Loup the Dyke. And auld Lightbody was married himsell to Marian, that was about my lady in the family 40 years syne. Aye, he had mony a day's daffing wi' Jean's mither, and they say she bides on with him. The carle has Jacobuses and Georgiuses baith, and none could get at them. And sure I am it's doing him an honour him or his never deserved at our hand, the ungracious sumph. And if he loses by us a'thegither, he's ain cheap o't, he can spare it brawly." Shaking off irresolution, therefore, and turning at once upon his heel, Caleb walked hastily back to the cooper's house, lifted the latch without ceremony, and in a moment found himself behind the hallan, or partition, from which position he could, himself unseen, reconnoitre the interior of the butt, or kitchen apartment, of the mansion. Reverse of the sad menage at the castle of Wolf's Crag, a bickering fire roared up the cooper's chimney. His wife on the one side, in her pearlings and pudding sleeves, put the last finishing touch to her holiday's apparel, while she contemplated a very handsome and good-humoured face in a broken mirror, raised upon the bink, the shelves on which the plates are disposed, for her special accommodation. Her mother, old lucky Loup the Dyke, a canty carline, as was within 20 miles of her, according to the unanimous report of the cummers, or gossips, sat by the fire in the full glory of a grogram gown, lammer beads, and a clean cockernony, whiffing a snug pipe of tobacco, and superintending the affairs of the kitchen, for, sight more interesting to the anxious heart and craving entrails of the desponding seneschal than either buxom dame or canty cummer, there bubbled on the aforesaid bickering fire a huge pot, or rather cauldron, steaming with beef and bruse, while before it revolved 2 spits, turned each by one of the cooper's apprentices, seated in the opposite corners of the chimney, the one loaded with a quarter of mutton, while the other was graced with a fat goose and a brace of wild ducks. The sight and scent of such a land of plenty almost wholly overcame the drooping spirits of Caleb. He turned, for a moment's space, to reconnoitre the ben, or parlour end of the house, and there saw a sight scarce less affecting to his feelings: a large round table, covered for 10 or 12 persons, decored, according to his own favourite terms, with napery as white as snow, grand flagons of pewter, intermixed with 1 or 2 silver cups, containing, as was probable, something worthy the brilliancy of their outward appearance, clean trenchers, cutty spoons, knives and forks, sharp, burnished, and prompt for action, which lay all displayed as for an especial festival. "The devil's in the peddling tub cooperin' carle," muttered Caleb, in all the envy of astonishment. "It's a shame to see the like of them gusting their gabs at sic a rate; but if some of that good cheer does not find its way to Wolf's Crag this night, my name is not Caleb Balderstone." So resolving, he entered the apartment, and in all courteous greeting saluted both the mother and the daughter. Wolf's Crag was the court of the barony, Caleb prime minister at Wolf's Crag, and it has ever been remarked that, though the masculine subject who pays the taxes sometimes growls at the courtiers by whom they are imposed, the said courtiers continue nevertheless welcome to the fair sex, to whom they furnish the newest small talk and the earliest fashions. Both the dames were, therefore, at once about old Caleb's neck, setting up their throats together by way of welcome. "Ay, sirs, Mr. Balderstone, and is this you? A sight of you is good for saireen. Sit down, the good man will be blithe to see you. You ne'er saw him sae cadgy in your life, but we are to christen our bit wame the night, as you will hae heard, and doubtless you will stay and see the ordnance. We hae killed the weather, and ane o' our lads has been out wi' his gun at the moss. Ye used to like wildfowl." "Na, gudewife," said Caleb, "I just keekit in to wish you joy, and I would be glad to hae spoken with the goodman, but," moving as if to go away, "then ne'er a fit ye's gang," said the elder dame, laughing and holding him fast, with a freedom which belonged to their old acquaintance. "Wha kens what ill it may bring to the bairn if ye ower look it in that gate?" "But I'm in a preceese hurry, gudewife," said the butler, suffering himself to be dragged to a seat without much resistance. "And as to eating," for he observed the mistress of the dwelling bustling about to place a trencher for him, "as for eating, lack a day, we are just killed up yonder wi' eating frae morning to night. It's a shameful epicurism, but that's what we hae gotten for the English pock puddings." "Hoot, never mind the English pock puddings," said Lucky Lightbody. "Try our puddings, Mr. Balderstone. There is black pudding and white hass. Try whilk ye like best." "Baith good, baith excellent, canna be better, but the very smell's enough for me that hae dined sae lately." The faithful wretch had fasted since daybreak. "But I wadna affront your housewife's kep, gudewife, and wi' your permission, I'se e'en put them in my napkin, and eat them to my supper at e'en, for I am wearied of Mysie's pastry and nonsense. Ye ken landward dainties aye pleased me best, Marion, and landward lassies too," looking at the cooper's wife. "Ne'er a bit but she looks far better than when she married Gilbert, and then she was the bonniest lass in our paroshin, and the neist tilt, but gossy cow, goodly calf." The women smiled at the compliment each to herself, and they smiled again to each other, as Caleb wrapped up the puddings in a towel which he had brought with him, as a dragoon carries his foraging bag to receive what may fall in his way. "And what news at the castle?" quo the goodwife. "News? The bravest news ye ever heard. The Lord Keeper's up yonder wi' his fair daughter, just ready to fling her at my lord's head, and I winna tak her out of his arms, and I'se warrant he'll stitch our auld lands of Ravenswood to her petticoat tail." "Eh, sirs, ay, and we'll hae her?" "And is she weel favoured? And what's the colour of her hair? And does she wear a habit or a raily?" were the questions which the females showered upon the butler. "Hoot, hoot! It would tak a man a day to answer all your questions, and I hae hardly a minute. Where's the goodman?" "Awa to fetch the minister," said Mrs. Girder. "Precious Mr. Peter Bide the Bent, frae the Moss Head. The honest man has the rheumatism wi' lying in the hills in the persecution." "Ay, Whig and a mountain man, nae less," said Caleb, with a peevishness he could not suppress. "I hae seen the day, Lucky, when worthy Mr. Cuffcushion and the service book would hae served your turn," to the elder dame, "or ony honest woman in like circumstances." "And that's true too," said Mrs. Lightbody; "but what can a body do? Jean maun baith sing her psalms and busk her cockernony the gate the goodman likes, and nae other gate, for he's maister and mair at hame, I can tell ye, Mr. Balderstone." "Ay, and does he guide the gear too?" said Caleb, to whose projects masculine rule boded little good. "Ilka penny on't, but he'll dress her as dink as a daisy, as ye see, sae she has little reason to complain. Where there's ane better aff, there's 10 waur." "Ah, weel, gudewife," said Caleb, crestfallen but not beaten off, "that wasna the way ye guided your goodman. But ilka land has its ain law. I'm on beganging. I just wanted to round in the goodman's lug, that I heard them say up by yonder that Peter Punchin, that was cooper to the Queen's stores at the Timmer Burse at Leith, is dead. So I thought that maybe a word from my lord to the Lord Keeper might hae served Gilbert. But since he's frae hame—" "Oh, but ye maun stay his hame coming," said the dame. "I aye telled the goodman ye meant weel to him, but he taxed tout at every bit lippening word." "Aweel, I'll stay the last minute I can." "And so," said the handsome young spouse of Mr. Girder, "ye think this Miss Ashton is weel favoured? Troth, and sae should she, to set up for our young lord, wi' a face and a hand, and a seat on his horse, that might become a king's son. D'ye ken that he aye glowers up at my window, Mr. Balderstone, when he chaunces to ride through the town? Sae I hae a right to ken what like he is, as weel's onybody." "I ken that brawly," said Caleb, "for I hae heard his lordship say the cooper's wife had the blackest ee in the barony; and I said, weel may that be, my lord, for it was her mother's afore her, as I ken to my cost, Marion? Ha, ha, ha! Ah, those were merry days." "Hout awa, old carle," said the old dame, "to speak sic daffing to young folk. But, Jean, fie, woman, dinna ye hear the bairn greet? I'se warn it's that dreary wide that has come out again." Up got mother and grandmother, and scoured away, jostling each other as they ran, into some remote corner of the tenement, where the young hero of the evening was deposited. When Caleb saw the coast fairly clear, he took an invigorating pinch of snuff, to sharpen and confirm his resolution. "Cauld be my cast," thought he, "if either Bide the Bent or Girder taste that broach of wild fowl this evening." And then addressing the eldest turnspit, a boy of about 11 years old, and putting a penny into his hand, he said, "Here's 12 pennies, my man. Carry that ower to Mrs. Smotrash, and bid her fill my mill with snishin, and I'll turn the broach for ye in the meantime, and she will gie ye a gingerbread snap for your pains." No sooner was the elder boy departed on this mission, than Caleb, looking the remaining turnspit gravely and steadily in the face, removed from the fire the spit bearing the wildfowl of which he had undertaken the charge, clapped his hat on his head, and fairly marched off with it. He stopped at the door of the change-house only to say, in a few brief words, that Mr. Hayston of Bucklaw was not to expect a bed that evening in the castle. If this message was too briefly delivered by Caleb, it became absolute rudeness when conveyed through the medium of a suburb landlady, and Bucklaw was, as a more calm and temperate man might have been, highly incensed. Captain Craigengelt proposed, with the unanimous applause of all present, that they should course the old fox, meaning Caleb, ere he got to cover, and toss him in a blanket. But Lockhard intimated to his master's servants and those of Lord Whittlebrains, in a tone of authority, that the slightest impertinence to the master of Ravenswood's domestic would give Sir William Ashton the highest offence. And having so said, in a matter sufficient to prevent any aggression on their part, he left the public house, taking along with him 2 servants loaded with such provisions as he had been able to procure, and overtook Caleb just when he had cleared the village. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of The Bride of Lammermoor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Hendry. The Bride of Lammermoor by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 13. Should I take aught of you? 'Tis true I begged now, and what is worse than that, I stole a kindness, and what is worst of all, I lost my way in't. Wit without money. The face of the little boy, sole witness of Caleb's infringement upon the laws at once of property and hospitality, would have made a good picture. He sat motionless, as if he had witnessed some of the spectral appearances which he had heard told of in a winter's evening, and as he forgot his own duty, he allowed his spit to stand still. He added to the misfortunes of the evening by suffering the mutton to burn as black as a coal. He was first recalled from his trance of astonishment by a hearty cuff, administered by Dame Lightbody, who, in whatever other respects she might conform to her name, was a woman strong of person and expert in the use of her hands, as some say her deceased husband had known to his cost. "What garred ye let the roast burn, ye ill clerk at Good for Now?" "I dinna ken," said the boy. "And where's that ill deedy get, Giles?" "I dinna ken," blubbered the astonished declarant. "And where's Mr. Balderstone? And abune a', and in the name of council and kirk session, that I should say sae, where's the brooch wi' the wild fowl?" As Mrs. Girder here entered, and joined her mother's exclamations, screaming into one ear while the old lady deafened the other, they succeeded in so utterly confounding the unhappy urchin that he could not for some time tell his story at all, and it was only when the elder boy returned that the truth began to dawn on their minds. "Weel, sirs," said Mrs. Lightbody, "wha wad hae thought o' Caleb Balderstone playing an auld acquaintance sic a pliskie?" "Oh, weary on him!" said the spouse of Mr. Girder; "and what am I to say to the good man? He'll brain me, if there wasna another woman in all Wolf's Hope." "Hoot toot, silly quean," said the mother. "Na, na, it's come to muckle, but it's no come to that neither, for an he brain you, he maun brain me, for I have garred his better stand back. Hands aff is fair play, he maunna heed a bit flyting." The tramp of horses now announced the arrival of the cooper with the minister. They had no sooner dismounted than they made for the kitchen fire, for the evening was cool after the thunderstorm, and the woods wet and dirty. The young goodwife, strong in the charms of her Sunday gown and bigonettes, threw herself in the way of receiving the first attack, while her mother, like the veteran division of the Roman legion, remained in the rear, ready to support her in case of necessity. Both hoped to protract the discovery of what had happened, the mother by interposing her bustling person betwixt Mr. Girder and the fire, and the daughter by the extreme cordiality with which she received the minister and her husband, and the anxious fears which she expressed lest they should have gotten called. "Called!" quoth the husband, surlily, for he was not of that class of lords and masters whose wives are viceroys over them. "We'll be called eneugh, I think, if ye dinna let us into the fire." And so saying, he burst his way through both lines of defence, and as he had a careful eye over his property of every kind, he perceived at one glance the absence of the spit with its savoury burden. "What the deil, woman?" "Fie, for shame!" exclaimed both the women, "and before Mr. Bide-the-Bent." "I stand reproved," said the cooper, "but—" "The taking in our mouths the name of the great enemy of our souls," said Mr. Bide-the-Bent. "I stand reproved," said the cooper. "Is an exposing ourselves to his temptations," continued the reverend monitor, "and in inviting, or in some sort a compelling of him to lay aside his other trafficking with unhappy persons, and wait upon those in whose speech his name is frequent." "Weel, weel, Mr. Bide-the-Bent, can a man do mair than stand reproved?" said the cooper. "But just let me ask the women, what for they hae dished the wildfowl before we came?" "They arena dished, Gilbert," said his wife, but an accident—" "What accident?" said Girder, with flashing eyes. "Nae ill come ower them, I trust, eh?" His wife, who stood much in awe of him, durst not reply, but her mother bustled up to her support, with arms disposed as if they were about to be akimbo at the next reply. "I gied them to an acquaintance of mine, Gibbie Girder, and what about it now?" Her excess of assurance struck Girder mute for an instant. "And ye gied the wildfowl, the best end of our christening dinner, to a friend of yours, ye auld rudas? And what might his name be, I pray you?" "Just worthy Mr. Caleb Balderstone, frae Wolf's Crag," answered Marion, prompt and prepared for battle. Girder's wrath foamed over all restraint. If there was a circumstance which could have added to the resentment he felt, it was that this extravagant donation had been made in favour of our friend Caleb, towards whom, for reasons to which the reader is no stranger, he nourished a decided resentment. He raised his riding wand against the elder matron, but she stood firm, collected in herself, and undauntedly brandished the iron ladle with which she had just been flambing, in English basting, the roast of mutton. Her weapon was certainly the better, and her arm not the weakest of the two, so that Gilbert thought it safest to turn short off upon his wife, who had by this time hatched a sort of hysterical whine, which greatly moved the minister, who was in fact as simple and kind-hearted a creature as ever breathed. "And you thowless jade, to sit still and see my substance disponsed upon an idle, drunken, reprobate, worm-eaten serving-man, just because he kittles the lugs o' a silly auld wife wi' useless clavers, and every twa words a lee. I'll gar he is good." Here the minister interposed, both by voice and action, while Dame Lightbody threw herself in front of her daughter, and flourished her ladle. "Am I no to chastise my ain wife?" exclaimed the cooper very indignantly. "Ye may chastise your ain wife if ye like," answered Dame Lightbody, "but ye shall never lay finger on my daughter, and that ye may found upon." "For shame, Mr. Girder," said the clergyman; "this is what I little expected to have seen of you, that you should give rein to your sinful passions against your nearest and dearest, and this night too, when you are called to the most solemn duty of a Christian parent, and all for what? For a redundancy of creature comforts as worthless as they are unneedful." "Worthless!" exclaimed the cooper; "a better goose never walkit on stubble. Two finer, daintier wild ducks never wat a feather." "Be it sae, neighbour," rejoined the minister; "but see what superfluities are yet revolving before your fire. I have seen the day when 10 of the bannocks which stand upon that board would have been an acceptable dainty to as many men that were starving on hills and bogs and in caves of the earth for the gospel's sake." "And that's what vexes me maist of a'," said the cooper, anxious to get some one to sympathise with his not altogether causeless anger. "And the Queen had gi'en it to ony suffering sant, or to onybody other, but that reiving, lying, oppressing Tory villain, that rade in the wicked troop of militia when it was commanded out against the sants at Bothwell Brig by the old tyrant Allan Ravenswood, that is gane to his place. I wad the less he minded it. But to gie the principal parts of the feast to the like of him—" "Aweel, Gilbert," said the minister, "and dinna ye see a high judgment in this? The seed of the righteous are not seen begging their bread. Think of the son of a powerful oppressor being brought to the pass of supporting his household from your fullness." "And besides," said the wife, "it wasna for Lord Ravenswood neither, and he would hear but a body speak. It was to help to entertain the Lord Keeper, as they ca' him, that's up yonder at Wolf's Crag." "Sir William Ashton at Wolf's Crag!" ejaculated the astonished man of hoops and staves. "And hand and glove wi' Lord Ravenswood," added Dame Lightbody. "Doited idiot! That auld clavering snake drawer would gar ye trow the moon is made of green cheese. The Lord Keeper and Ravenswood, they are cat and dog, hare and hound. I tell ye they are man and wife, and gree better than some others that are sae," retorted the mother-in-law. "Forbye, Peter Puncheon, that's cooper of the Queen's stores, is dead, and the place is to fill, and— God guide us, will ye haud your skirling tongues?" said Girder; for we are to remark that this explanation was given like a catch for two voices, the younger dame, much encouraged by the turn of the debate, taking up and repeating in a higher tone the words as fast as they were uttered by her mother. "The good wife says naething but what's true, maester," said Girder's foreman, who had come in during the fray. "I saw the Lord Keeper's servants drinking and driving ower at Luckie Sma'trash's, ower by yonder." "And is their maester up at Wolf's Crag?" said Girder. "Ay, truth is he," replied his man of confidence. "And friends wi' Ravenswood?" "It's like sae," answered the foreman, "since he is putting up wi' him." "And Peter Puncheon's dead?" "Ay, ay, Puncheon has leaked out at last, the auld carle," said the foreman. "Mony a dribble of brandy has gane through him in his day." But as for the brooch and the wildfowl, the saddle's no aff your mare yet, measter, and I could follow and bring it back, for Mr. Balderstone's no far aff the town yet." "Do say, Will, and come here. I'll tell you what to do when you overtake him." He relieved the females of his presence, and gave Will his private instructions. "A bonny like thing," said the mother-in-law, as the cooper re-entered the apartment, "to send the innocent lad after an armed man, when ye ken Mr. Balderstone aye wears a rapier, and whiles a dirk into the bargain." "I trust," said the minister, "ye have reflected weel on what ye have done, lest ye should minister cause of strife, of which it is my duty to say, he who affordeth matter, albeit he himself striketh not, is in no matter guiltless." "Never fash your beard, Mr. Bide-the-Bent," replied Girder. "Yin canna get their breath out here between wives and ministers. I ken best how to turn my ain cake. Jean, serve up the dinner, and nae mair about it." Nor did he again allude to the deficiency in the course of the evening. Meantime, the foreman, mounted on his master's steed, and charged with his special orders, pricked swiftly forth in pursuit of the marauder Caleb. That personage, it may be imagined, did not linger by the way. He intermitted even his dearly beloved chatter for the purpose of making more haste, only assuring Mr. Lockhard that he had made the purveyor's wife give the wildfowl a few turns before the fire, in case that Mysie, who had been so much alarmed by the thunder, should not have her kitchen grate in full splendour. Meanwhile, alleging the necessity of being at Wolf's Crag as soon as possible, he pushed on so fast that his companions could scarce keep up with him. He began already to think he was safe from pursuit, having gained the summit of the swelling eminence which divides Wolf's Crag from the village, when he heard the distant tread of a horse, and a voice which shouted at intervals, "Mr. Caleb! Mr. Balderstone! Mr. Caleb Balderstone! Hullo! Bide a wee!" Caleb, it may be well believed, was in no hurry to acknowledge the summons. First, he would not hear it, and faced his companions down that it was the echo of the wind. Then he said it was not worth stopping for, and at length, halting reluctantly, as the figure of the horseman appeared through the shades of the evening, he bent up his whole soul to the task of defending his prey, threw himself into an attitude of dignity, advanced the spit, which in his grasp might with its burden seem both spear and shield, and firmly resolved to die rather than surrender it. What was his astonishment when the cooper's foreman, riding up and addressing him with respect, told him his master was very sorry he was absent when he came to his dwelling, and grieved that he could not tarry the christening dinner, and that he had ta'en the freedom to send a small runlet of sack, and yin anker of brandy, as he understood there were guests at the castle, and that they were short of preparation. I have heard somewhere a story of an elderly gentleman who was pursued by a bear that had gotten loose from its muzzle, until completely exhausted. In a fit of desperation, he faced round upon Bruin and lifted his cane, at the sight of which the instinct of discipline prevailed, and the animal, instead of tearing him to pieces, rose up upon his hind legs, and instantly began to shuffle a saraband. Not less than the joyful surprise of the senior, who had supposed himself in the extremity of peril from which he was thus unexpectedly relieved, was that of our excellent friend Caleb, when he found the pursuer intended to add to his prize instead of bereaving him of it. He recovered his latitude, however, instantly, so soon as the foreman, stepping from his nag, where he sat perched betwixt the two barrels, whispered in his ears, if ony thing about Peter Punchin's place could be airted their way, John Gibbie Girder would mak it better to the Master of Ravenswood than a pair of new gloves, and that he would be blithe to speak wi' Master Balderstone on that head, and he would find him as pliant as a hoop willow in all that he could wish of him. Caleb heard all this without rendering any answer, except that of all great men from Louis XIV. Downwards, namely, "We will see about it," and then added aloud, for the edification of Mr. Lockhard, "Your master has acted with becoming civility and attention in forwarding the liquors, and I will not fail to represent it properly to my Lord Ravenswood. And, my lad," he said, "you may ride on to the castle, and if none of the servants are returned, whilk is to be dreaded, as they make day and night of it when they are out of sight, you may put them into the porter's lodge, whilk is on the right hand of the great entry. The porter has got leave to go to see his friends, so you will meet nae ane to steer ye." The foreman, having received his orders, rode on, and having deposited the casks in the deserted and ruinous porter's lodge, he returned unquestioned by any one. Having thus executed his master's commission, and doffed his bonnet to Caleb and his company as he repassed them in his way to the village, he returned to have his share of the christening festivity. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of the Bride of Lammermoor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Henry. The Bride of Lammermoor by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 14. As, to the autumn breeze's bugle sound, various and vague the dry leaves dance their round, or, from the garner door, on either borne, the chaff flies devious from the winnowed corn, so vague, so devious, at the breath of heaven, from their fixed aim are mortal counsels driven. Anonymous. We left Caleb Balderstone in the extremity of triumph at the success of his various achievements for the honour of the house of Ravenswood. When he had mustered and marshalled his dishes of divers kinds, a more royal provision had not been seen in Wolf's Crag since the funeral feast of its deceased lord. Great was the glory of the serving man, as he decored the old oaken table with a clean cloth, and arranged upon it carbonaded venison and roasted wildfowl, with a glance every now and then, as if to upbraid the incredulity of his master and his guests. And with many a story, more or less true, was Lockhard that evening regaled concerning the ancient grandeur of Wolf's Crag, and the sway of its barons over the country in their neighbourhood. A vassal scarce held a calf or a lamb his ain, till he had first asked if the Lord of Ravenswood was pleased to accept it, and they were obliged to ask the Lord's consent before they married in these days, and mony a merry tale they tell about that right as weel as others. And although, said Caleb, these times are not like the good old times, when authority had its right, yet true it is, Mr. Lockhard, and you yourself may partly have remarked, that we of the house of Ravenswood do our endeavour in keeping up, by all just and lawful exertion of our baronial authority, that due and fitting connexion betwixt superior and vassal, whilk is in some danger of falling into disuetude, owing to the general licence and misrule of these present unhappy times. Umph, said Mr. Lockhard, and if I may inquire, Mr. Balderstone, pray do you find your people at the village yonder amenable? For I must needs say, that at Ravenswood Castle, now pertaining to my master the Lord Keeper, you have not left behind ye the most compliant set of tenantry. Ah, but Mr. Lockhard, replied Caleb, ye must consider there has been a change of hands, and the old lord might expect twa turns frae them when the newcomer canna get in. A dour and fractious set they were, they tenants of Ravenswood, and ill to live wi' when they dinna ken their master, and if your master put them mad yence, the whole country will not put them down. Troth, said Mr. Lockhard, an such be the case, I think the wisest thing for us all would be to hammer up a match between your young lord and our winsome young lady up by there, and Sir William might just stitch your old barony to her gown sleeve, and he would soon cuttle another out of somebody else, sic a lang head as he has. Caleb shook his head. I wish, he said, I wish that may answer, Mr. Lockhard. There are auld prophecies about this house I would like ill to see fulfilled wi' my auld een, that has seen evil enough already. Pshaw! Never mind freits, said his brother butler. If the young folk liked ane another, they would make a winsome couple. But to say truth, there is a leddy sits in our hall neuk, maun have her hand in that as weel as in every other job. But there's no harm in drinking to their healths, and I will fill Mrs. Mysie a cup of Mr. Girder's canary." While they thus enjoyed themselves in the kitchen, the company in the hall were not less pleasantly engaged. So soon as Ravenswood had determined upon giving the Lord Keeper such hospitality as he had to offer, he deemed it incumbent on him to assume the open and courteous brow of a well-pleased host. It has been often remarked that when a man commences by acting a character, he frequently ends by adopting it in good earnest. In the course of an hour or two, Ravenswood, to his own surprise, found himself in the situation of one who frankly does his best to entertain welcome and honoured guests. How much of this change in his disposition was to be ascribed to the beauty and simplicity of Miss Ashton, to the readiness with which she accommodated herself to the inconveniences of her situation, how much to the smooth and plausible conversation of the Lord Keeper, remarkably gifted with those words which win the ear, must be left to the reader's ingenuity to conjecture. But Ravenswood was insensible to neither. The Lord Keeper was a veteran statesman, well acquainted with courts and cabinets, and intimate with all the various turns of public affairs during the last eventful years of the 17th century. He could talk from his own knowledge of men and events in a way which failed not to win attention, and had the peculiar art, while he never said a word which committed himself, at the same time to persuade the hearer that he was speaking without the least shadow of scrupulous caution or reserve. Ravenswood, in spite of his prejudices and real grounds of resentment, felt himself at once amused and instructed in listening to him, while the statesman, whose inward feelings had at first so much impeded his efforts to make himself known, had now regained all the ease and fluency of a silver-tongued lawyer of the very highest order. His daughter did not speak much, but she smiled, and what she did say argued a submissive gentleness and a desire to give pleasure, which, to a proud man like Ravenswood, was more fascinating than the most brilliant wit. Above all, he could not but observe that, whether from gratitude or from some other motive, he himself, in his deserted and unprovided hall, was as much the object of respectful attention to his guests as he would have been when surrounded by all the appliances and means of hospitality proper to his high birth. All deficiencies passed unobserved, or if they did not escape notice, it was to praise the substitutes which Caleb had contrived to supply the want of the usual accommodations. Where a smile was unavoidable, it was a very good-humoured one, and often coupled with some well-turned compliment, to show how much the guests esteemed the merits of their noble host, how little they thought of the inconveniences with which they were surrounded. I am not sure whether the pride of being found to outbalance, in virtue of his own personal merit, all the disadvantages of fortune, did not make as favourable an impression upon the haughty heart of the Master of Ravenswood as the conversation of the father and the beauty of Lucy Ashton. The hour of repose arrived. The Keeper and his daughter retired to their apartments, which were decored more properly than could have been anticipated. In making the necessary arrangements, Mysie had indeed enjoyed the assistance of a gossip who had arrived from the village upon an exploratory expedition, but had been arrested by Caleb and impressed into the domestic drudgery of the evening, so that, instead of returning home to describe the dress and person of the grand young lady, she found herself compelled to be active in the domestic economy of Wolf's Crag. According to the custom of the time, the Master of Ravenswood attended the Lord Keeper to his apartment, followed by Caleb, who placed on the table, with all the ceremonials due to torches of wax, 2 rudely framed tallow candles, such as in those days were only used by the peasantry, hooped in paltry clasps of wire, which served for candlesticks. He then disappeared, and presently entered with 2 earthen flagons. The china, he said, had been little used since my lady's time. One filled with canary wine, the other with brandy. The canary sack, unheeding all probabilities of detection, he declared had been 20 years in the cellars of Wolf's Crag. Though it was not for him to speak before their honours, the brandy, it was weel-kenned liquor, as mild as mead and as strong as Samson. It had been in the house ever since the memorable revel in which auld Michelstob had been slain at the head of the stair by Jamie of Jenkelbray, on account of the honour of the worshipful Lady Muirhead. wha was in some sort an ally of the family, natheless—" "But to cut that matter short, Mr. Caleb," said the Keeper, "perhaps you will favour me with a ewer of water." "God forbid your lordship should drink water in this family," replied Caleb, "to the disgrace of so honourable a house." "Nevertheless, if his lordship have a fancy," said the Master, smiling, "I think you might indulge him; for, if I mistake not, there has been water drank here at no distant date, and with good relish too." "To be sure, if his lordship has a fancy," said Caleb; and re-entering with a jug of pure element, "he will scarce find such water onywhere that is drawn frae the well at Wolf's Crag. Nevertheless—" "Nevertheless, we must leave the Lord Keeper to his repose in this poor chamber of ours," said the Master of Ravenswood, interrupting his talkative domestic, who, immediately turning to the doorway, with a profound reverence, prepared to usher his master from the secret chamber. But the Lord Keeper prevented his host's departure. "I have but one word to say to the Master of Ravenswood, Mr. Caleb, and I fancy he will excuse your waiting." With a second reverence, lower than the former, Caleb withdrew, and his master stood motionless, expecting, with considerable embarrassment, what was to close the events of a day fraught with unexpected incidents. "Master of Ravenswood," said Sir William Ashton, with some embarrassment, "I hope you understand the Christian law too well to suffer the sun to set upon your anger." The Master blushed, and replied, "He had no occasion that evening to exercise the duty enjoined upon him by his Christian faith." "I should have thought otherwise," said his guest, "considering the various subjects of dispute and litigation which have unhappily occurred more frequently than was desirable or necessary betwixt the late honourable lord your father and myself." "I could wish, my lord," said Ravenswood, agitated by suppressed emotion, "that reverence to these circumstances should be made anywhere rather than under my father's roof." "I should have felt the delicacy of this appeal at another time," said Sir William Ashton; "but now I must proceed with what I mean to say. I have suffered too much in my own mind from the false delicacy which prevented my soliciting with earnest, what indeed I frequently requested, a personal communing with your father. Much distress of mind to him and to me might have been prevented." "It is true," said Ravenswood, after a moment's reflection, "I have heard my father say your lordship had proposed a personal interview." "Proposed, my dear master? I did indeed propose it, but I ought to have begged, entreated, beseeched it. I ought to have torn away the veil which interested persons had stretched betwixt us, and shown myself as I was, willing to sacrifice a considerable part even of my legal rights, in order to conciliate feelings so natural as his must be allowed to have been. Let me say for myself, my young friend, for so I will call you, that had your father and I spent the same time together which my good fortune has allowed me today to pass in your company, it is possible the land might yet have enjoyed one of the most respectable of its ancient nobility, and I should have been spared the pain of parting in enmity from a person whose general character I so much admired and honoured." He put his handkerchief to his eyes. Ravenswood also was moved, but awaited in silence the progress of this extraordinary communication. "It is necessary," continued the Lord Keeper, "and proper, that you should understand that there have been many points betwixt us, in which, although I judged it proper that there should be an exact ascertainment of my legal rights by the decree of a court of justice, yet it was never my intention to press them beyond the verge of equity." "My lord," said the Master of Ravenswood, "it is unnecessary to pursue this topic farther. What the law will give you, or has given you, you enjoy, or you shall enjoy. Neither my father nor I myself would have received anything on the footing of favour." "Favour? No, you misunderstand me," resumed the Keeper, "or rather you are no lawyer. A right may be good in law, and ascertained to be so, which yet a man of honour may not in every case care to avail himself of." "I am sorry for it, my lord," said the Master. "Nay, nay," retorted his guest, You speak like a young counsellor. Your spirit goes before your wit. There are many things still open for decision betwixt us. Can you blame me, an old man desirous of peace, and in the castle of a young nobleman who has saved my daughter's life and my own, that I am desirous, anxiously desirous, that these should be settled on the most liberal principles?" The old man kept fast hold of the master's passive hand as he spoke, and made it impossible for him, be his predetermination what it would, to return any other than an acquiescent reply, and wishing his guest good night, he postponed farther conference until the next morning. Ravenswood hurried into the hall, where he was to spend the night, and for a time traversed its pavement with a disordered and rapid pace. His mortal foe was under his roof, yet his sentiments towards him were neither those of a feudal enemy nor of a true Christian. He felt as if he could neither forgive him in the one character, nor follow forth his vengeance in the other, but that he was making a base and dishonourable composition betwixt his resentment against the father and his affection for his daughter. He cursed himself as he hurried to and fro in the pale moonlight, and more ruddy gleams of the expiring wood fire. He threw open and shut the latticed windows with violence, as if alike impatient of the admission and exclusion of free air. At length, however, the torrent of passion foamed off its madness, and he flung himself into the chair which he proposed as his place of repose for the night. If, in reality, such were the calmer thoughts that followed the first tempest of his passion, if, in reality, this man desires no more than the law allows him, if he is willing to adjust even his acknowledged rights upon an equitable footing, what could be my father's cause of complaint? What is mine? Those from whom we won our ancient possessions fell under the sword of my ancestors, and left lands and livings to the conquerors. We sink under the force of the law, now too powerful for the Scottish cavalry. Let us parley with the victors of the day, as if we had been besieged in our fortress, and without hope of relief. This man may be other than I have thought him, and his daughter— but I have resolved not to think of her. He wrapped his cloak around him, fell asleep, and dreamed of Lucy Ashton till daylight gleamed through the lattices. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Bride of Lammermoor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Hendry. The Bride of Lammermoor by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 15. We worldly men, when we see friends and kinsmen past hope sunk in their fortunes, lend no hand to lift them up, but rather set our feet upon their heads to press them to the bottom. As I must yield with you, I practised it, but now I see you in a way to rise, I can and will assist you. New way to pay old debts. The Lord Keeper carried with him, to a couch harder than he was accustomed to stretch himself upon, the same ambitious thoughts and political perplexities which drive sleep from the softest down that ever spread a bed of state. He had sailed long enough amid the contending tides and currents of the time to be sensible of their peril, and of the necessity of trimming his vessel to the prevailing wind, if he would have her escape shipwreck in the storm. The nature of his talents, and the timorousness of disposition connected with them, had made him assume the pliability of the versatile old Earl of Northampton, who explained the art by which he kept his ground during all the changes of state, from the reign of Henry VIII to that of Elizabeth, by the frank avowal that he was born of the willow, not of the oak. It had accordingly been Sir William Ashton's policy, on all occasions, to watch the changes in the political horizon, and, ere yet the conflict was decided, to negotiate some interest for himself with the party most likely to prove victorious. His time-serving disposition was well known, and excited the contempt of the more daring leaders of both factions in the state. But his talents were of a useful and practical kind, and his legal knowledge held in high estimation, and they so far counterbalanced other deficiencies that those in power were glad to use and to reward, though without absolutely trusting or greatly respecting him. The Marquis of A had used his utmost influence to effect a change in the Scottish cabinet, and his schemes had been of late so well laid and so ably supported, that there appeared a very great chance of his proving ultimately successful. He did not, however, feel so strong or so confident as to neglect any means of drawing recruits to his standard. The acquisition of the Lord Keeper was deemed of some importance, and a friend, perfectly acquainted with his circumstances and character, became responsible for his political conversion. When this gentleman arrived at Ravenswood Castle upon a visit, the real purpose of which was disguised under general courtesy, he found the prevailing fear which at present beset the Lord Keeper was that of danger to his own person from the Master of Ravenswood. The language which the blind Sibyl, old Alice, had used, the sudden appearance of the Master armed and within his precincts, immediately after he had been warned against danger from him, the cold and haughty return received in exchange for the acknowledgments with which he loaded him for his timely protection, had all made a strong impression on his imagination. So soon as the Marquis's political agent found how the wind sat, he began to insinuate fears and doubts of another kind, scarce less calculated to affect the Lord Keeper. He inquired with seeming interest whether the proceedings in Sir William's complicated litigation with the Ravenswood family were out of court and settled without the possibility of appeal. The Lord Keeper answered in the affirmative, but his interrogator was too well informed to be imposed upon. He pointed out to him, by unanswerable arguments, that some of the most important points which had been decided in his favour against the House of Ravenswood were liable, under the Treaty of Union, to be reviewed by the British House of Peers, a court of equity of which the Lord Keeper felt an instinctive dread. This course came instead of an appeal to the old Scottish Parliament, or, as it was technically termed, a protestation for remit in law. The Lord Keeper, after he had for some time disputed the legality of such a proceeding, was compelled at length to comfort himself with the improbability of the young Master of Ravenswood's finding friends in Parliament capable of stirring in so weighty an affair. "Do not comfort yourself with that false hope," said his wily friend. "It is possible that, in the next session of Parliament, young Ravenswood may find more friends and favour even than your lordship." "That would be a sight worth seeing," said the Keeper scornfully. "And yet," said his friend, "such things have been seen ere now, and in our own time. There are many at the head of affairs even now that a few years ago were under hiding for their lives, and many a man now dines on plates of silver that was fain to eat his crowdie without a bicker, and many a high head has been brought full low among us in as short a space. Scott of Scotsarvert's staggering State of Scots Statesmen, of which curious memoir you showed me a manuscript, has been out-staggered in our time." The Lord Keeper answered with a deep sigh, that these mutations were no new sights in Scotland, and had been witnessed long before the time of this satirical author he had quoted. It was many a long year, he said, since Fordun had quoted as an ancient proverb, "Neque dives, neque fortes, sed nec sapiens Scotus, predominante individia, Dio durabit in terra." "And be assured, my esteemed friend," was the answer, "that even your long services to the state, or deep legal knowledge, will not save you, or render your estate stable, if the Marquis of A comes in with a party in the British Parliament. You know that the deceased Lord Ravenswood was his near ally, his lady being fifth in descent from the Knight of Tillibardine, and I am well assured that he will take young Ravenswood by the hand, and be his very good lord and kinsman. Why should he not? The master is an active and stirring young fellow, able to help himself with tongue and hands, and it is such as he that finds friends among their kindred, and not those unarmed and unable Mephibosheths, that are sure to be a burden to every one that takes them up. And so, if these Ravenswood cases be called over the coals in the House of Peers, you will find that the Marquis will have a crow to pluck with you." "That would be an evil requital," said the Lord Keeper, "for my long services to the state, and the ancient respect in which I have held his lordship's honourable family and person." "Ay, but," rejoined the agent of the Marquis, "it is in vain to look back on past service and auld respect, my lord. It will be present service and immediate proofs of regard, which in these sliddery times will be expected by a man like the Marquis." The Lord Keeper now saw the full drift of his friend's argument, but he was too cautious to return any positive answer. He knew not, he said, the service which the Lord Marquis could expect from one of his limited abilities, that had not always stood at his command, still saving and reserving his duty to his king and country. Having thus said nothing, while he seemed to say everything, for the exception was calculated to cover whatever he might afterwards think proper to bring under it, Sir William Ashton changed the conversation, nor did he again permit the same topic to be introduced. His guest departed, without having brought the wily old statesman the length of committing himself, or of pledging himself to any future line of conduct, but with the certainty that he had alarmed his fears in a most sensible point, and laid a foundation for future and farther treaty. When he rendered an account of his negotiation to the Marquis, they both agreed that the Keeper ought not to be permitted to relapse into security, and that he should be plied with new subjects of alarm, especially during the absence of his lady. They were well aware that her proud, vindictive, and predominating spirit would be likely to supply him with the courage in which he was deficient, that she was immovably attached to the party now in power, with whom she maintained a close correspondence and alliance, and that she hated, without fearing, the Ravenswood family, whose more ancient dignity threw discredit on the newly acquired grandeur of her husband, to such a degree that she would have perilled the interest of her own house to have the prospect of altogether crushing that of her enemy. But Lady Ashton was now absent. The business which had long detained her in Edinburgh had afterwards induced her to travel to London, not without the hope that she might contribute her share to disconcert the intrigues of the Marquis at court, for she stood high in favour with the celebrated Sarah, Duchess of Marlborough, to whom, in point of character, she bore considerable resemblance. It was necessary to press her husband hard before her return, and as a preparatory step, the Marquis wrote to the Master of Ravenswood the letter which we rehearsed in a former chapter. It was cautiously worded, so as to leave it in the power of the writer hereafter to take as deep or as slight an interest in the fortunes of his kinsman as the progress of his own schemes might require. But however unwilling as a statesman the Marquis might be to commit himself or assume the character of a patron while he had nothing to give away, it must be said to his honour that he felt a strong inclination effectively to befriend the Master of Ravenswood, as well as to use his name as a means of alarming the terrors of the Lord Keeper. As the messenger who carried this letter was to pass near the house of the Lord Keeper, he had it in direction that in the village adjoining to the park gate of the castle his horse should lose a shoe, and that, while it was replaced by the smith of the place, he should express the utmost regret for the necessary loss of time, and in the vehemence of his impatience give it to be understood that he was bearing a message from the Marquis of A to the Master of Ravenswood upon a matter of life and death. This news, with exaggerations, was speedily carried from various quarters to the ears of the Lord Keeper, and each reporter dwelt upon the extreme impatience of the courier, and the surprising short time in which he had executed his journey. The anxious statesman heard in silence, but in private Lockhard received orders to watch the courier on his return, to waylay him in the village, to ply him with liquor if possible, and to use all means, fair or foul, to learn the contents of the letter of which he was the bearer. But as this plot had been foreseen, the messenger returned by a different and distant road, and thus escaped the snare that was laid for him. After he had been in vain expected for some time, Mr. Dingwall had orders to make a special inquiry among his clients of Wolf's Hope, whether such a domestic belonging to the Marquis of A had actually arrived at the neighbouring castle. This was easily ascertained, for Caleb had been in the village one morning by 5 o'clock to borrow "twa chappins of ale and a kipper" for the messenger's refreshment, and the poor fellow had been ill for 24 hours at Lucky Sma'trash's, in consequence of dining upon "saut salmon and sour drink," so that the existence of a correspondence betwixt the Marquis and his distressed kinsman, which Sir William Ashton had sometimes treated as a bugbear, was proved beyond the possibility of further doubt. The alarm of the Lord Keeper became very serious, since the claim of right, the power of appealing from the decisions of the civil court to the Estates of Parliament, which had formerly been held incompetent, had in many instances been claimed, and in some allowed, and he had no small reason to apprehend the issue if the English House of Lords should be disposed to act upon an appeal from the Master of Ravenswood for remit in law. It would resolve into an equitable claim, and be decided perhaps upon the broad principles of justice, which were not quite so favourable to the Lord Keeper as those of strict law. Besides, judging, though most inaccurately, from courts which he had himself known in the unhappy times preceding the Scottish Union, the Keeper might have too much right to think that in the house to which his lawsuits were to be transferred the old maxim might prevail, which was too well recognised in Scotland in former times: "Show me the man, and I'll show you the law." The high and unbiassed character of English judicial proceedings was then little known in Scotland, and the extension of them to that country was one of the most valuable advantages which it gained by the Union. But this was a blessing which the Lord Keeper, who had lived under another system, could not have the means of foreseeing. In the loss of his political consequence, he anticipated the loss of his lawsuit. Meanwhile, every report which reached him served to render the success of the Marquis's intrigues the more probable, and the Lord Keeper began to think it indispensable that he should look round for some kind of protection against the coming storm. The timidity of his temper induced him to adopt measures of compromise and conciliation. The affair of the wild bull, properly managed, might, he thought, be made to facilitate a personal communication and reconciliation betwixt the Master and himself. He would then learn, if possible, what his own ideas were of the extent of his rights and the means of enforcing them, and perhaps matters might be brought to a compromise, where one party was wealthy and the other so very poor. A reconciliation with Ravenswood was likely to give him an opportunity to play his own game with the Marquis of A. "And besides," he said to himself, "it will be an act of generosity to raise up the heir of this distressed family, and if he is to be warmly and effectually befriended by the new government, who knows but my virtue may prove its own reward?" Thus thought Sir William Ashton, covering with no unusual self-delusion his interested views with a hue of virtue, and having attained this point, his fancy strayed still further. He began to bethink himself that, if Ravenswood was to have a distinguished place of power and trust, and if such a union would soppet the heavier part of his unadjusted claims, there might be worse matches for his daughter Lucy. The Master might be repond against the attainder. Lord Ravenswood was an ancient title, and the alliance would, in some measure, legitimate his own possession of the greater part of the Master's spoils, and make the surrender of the rest a subject of less bitter regret. With these mingled and multifarious plans occupying his head, the Lord Keeper availed himself of my Lord Bittlebrain's repeated invitation to his residence, and thus came within a very few miles of Wolf's Crag. Here he found the lord of the mansion absent, but was courteously received by the lady, who expected her husband's immediate return. She expressed her particular delight at seeing Miss Ashton, and appointed the hounds to be taken out for the Lord Keeper's special amusement. He readily entered into the proposal, as giving him an opportunity to reconnoitre Wolf's Crag, and perhaps to make some acquaintance with the owner, if he should be tempted from his desolate mansion by the chase. Lockhard had his orders to endeavour on his part to make some acquaintance with the inmates of the castle, and we have seen how he played his part. The accidental storm did more to further the Lord Keeper's plan of forming a personal acquaintance with young Ravenswood than his most sanguine expectations could have anticipated. His fear of the young nobleman's personal resentment had greatly decreased, since he considered him as formidable from his legal claims, and the means he might have of enforcing them. But although he thought, not unreasonably, that only desperate circumstances drove men on desperate measures, it was not without a secret terror which shook his heart within him that he first felt himself enclosed within the desolate tower of Wolf's Crag, a place so well fitted from solitude and strength to be a scene of violence and vengeance. The stern reception at first given to them by the Master of Ravenswood, and the difficulty he felt in explaining to that injured nobleman what guests were under the shelter of his roof, did not soothe these alarms, so that when Sir William Ashton heard the door of the courtyard shut behind him with violence, the words of Alice rung in his ears, that he had drawn on matters too hardly with so fierce a race as those of Ravenswood, and that they would bide their time to be avenged. The subsequent frankness of the Master's hospitality, as their acquaintance increased, abated the apprehensions these recollections were calculated to excite, and it did not escape Sir William Ashton that it was to Lucy's grace and beauty he owed the change in their host's behaviour. All these thoughts thronged upon him when he took possession of the secret chamber. The iron lamp, the unfurnished apartment, more resembling a prison than a place of ordinary repose, the hoarse and ceaseless sound of the waves rushing against the base of the rock on which the castle was founded, saddened and perplexed his mind. To his own successful machinations, the ruin of the family had been in a great measure owing, but his disposition was crafty and not cruel, so that actually to witness the desolation and distress he had himself occasioned was as painful to him as it would be to the humane mistress of a family to superintend in person the execution of the lambs and poultry which are killed by her own directions. At the same time, when he thought of the alternative of restoring to Ravenswood a large proportion of his spoils, or of adopting as an ally and member of his own family the heir of this impoverished house, he felt as the spider may be supposed to do when his whole web, the intricacies of which had been planned with so much art, is destroyed by the chance sweep of a broom. And then, if he should commit himself too far in this matter, it gave rise to a perilous question, which many a good husband, when under temptation to act as a free agent, has asked himself, without being able to return a satisfactory answer: what will my wife, what will Lady Ashton say? On the whole, he came at length to the resolution in which minds of a weaker cast so often take refuge. He resolved to watch events, to take advantage of circumstances as they occurred, and regulate his conduct accordingly. In this spirit of temporizing policy, he at length composed his mind to rest. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of The Bride of Lammermoor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Hendry. The Bride of Lammermoor by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 16. A slight note I have about me for you, for the delivery of which you must excuse me. It is an offer that friendship calls upon me to do, and no way offensive to you, since I desire nothing but right upon both sides. King and no king. When Ravenswood and his guest met in the morning, the gloom of the Master's spirit had in part returned. He also had passed a night rather of reflection than of slumber, and the feelings which he could not but entertain towards Lucy Ashton had to support a severe conflict against those which he had so long nourished against her father. To clasp in friendship the hand of the enemy of his house, to entertain him under his roof, to exchange with him the courtesies and the kindness of domestic familiarity, was a degradation which his proud spirit could not be bent to without a struggle. But the ice being once broken, the Lord Keeper was resolved it should not have time again to freeze. It had been part of his plan to stun and confuse Ravenswood's ideas by a complicated and technical statement of the matters which had been in debate betwixt their families, justly thinking that it would be difficult for a youth of his age to follow the expositions of a practical lawyer, concerning actions of compt and reckoning, and of multiple poindings, and adjudications and wadsets, proper and improper, and poindings of the ground, and declarations of the expiry of the legal. Thus, thought Sir William, I shall have all the grace of appearing perfectly communicative, while my party will derive very little advantage from anything I may tell him. He therefore took Ravenswood aside into the deep recess of a window in the hall, and resuming the discourse of the preceding evening, expressed a hope that his young friend would assume some patience, in order to hear him enter in a minute and explanatory detail of those unfortunate circumstances in which his late honourable father had stood at variance with the Lord Keeper. The Master of Ravenswood coloured highly, but was silent, and the Lord Keeper, though not greatly approving the sudden heightening of his auditor's complexion, commenced the history of a bond for 20,000 merks, advanced by his father to the father of Allan Lord Ravenswood, and was proceeding to detail the executorial proceedings by which this large sum had been rendered a debitum fundi, when he was interrupted by the Master. "It is not in this place," he said, "that I can hear Sir William Ashton's explanation of the matters in question between us. It is not here, where my father died of a broken heart, that I can, with decency or temper, investigate the cause of his distress. I might remember that I was a son, and forget the duties of a host. A time, however, there must come when these things shall be discussed, in a place and in a presence where both of us will have equal freedom to speak and to hear." Any time, the Lord Keeper said, any place, was alike to those who sought nothing but justice. Yet it would seem he was, in fairness, entitled to some premonition respecting the grounds upon which the Master proposed to impugn the whole train of legal proceedings, which had been so well and ripely advised in the only courts competent. "Sir William Ashton," answered the Master with warmth, "the lands which you now occupy were granted to my remote ancestor for services done with his sword against the English invaders. How they have glided from us by a train of proceedings that seem to be neither sale nor mortgage nor adjudication for debt, but a nondescript and entangled mixture of all these rights. How annual rent has been accumulated upon principal, and no nook or coin of legal advantage left unoccupied, until our interest in our hereditary property seems to have melted away like an icicle in thaw. All this you understand better than I do. I am willing, however, to suppose, from the frankness of your conduct towards me, that I may in a great measure have mistaken your personal character, and that things may have appeared right and fitting to you, a skilful and practised lawyer, which to my ignorant understanding seem very little short of injustice and gross oppression." "And you, my dear master," answered Sir William, "you, permit me to say, have been equally misrepresented to me. I was taught to believe you a fierce, imperious, hot-headed youth, ready at the slightest provocation to throw your sword into the scales of justice, and to appeal to those rude and forcible measures from which civil polity has long protected the people of Scotland. Then, since we were mutually mistaken in each other, why should not the young nobleman be willing to listen to the old lawyer, while at least he explains the points of difference betwixt them?" "No, my lord," answered Ravenswood, "it is in the House of British Peers, whose honour must be equal to their rank. It is in the court of last resort that we must parley together. The belted lords of Britain, her ancient peers, must decide if it is their will that a house, not the least noble of their members, shall be stripped of their possessions, the reward of the patriotism of generations, as the pawn of a wretched mechanic becomes forfeit to the usurer the instant the hour of redemption has passed away. If they yield to the grasping severity of the creditor, and to the gnawing usury that eats into our lands as moths into a raiment, it will be of more evil consequence to them and their posterity than to Edgar Ravenswood. I shall still have my sword and my cloak, and can follow the profession of arms wherever a trumpet shall sound." As he pronounced these words, in a firm yet melancholy tone, he raised his eyes, and suddenly encountered those of Lucy Ashton, who had stolen unawares on their interview, and observed her looks fastened on them with an expression of enthusiastic interest and admiration, which had wrapped her for the moment beyond the fear of discovery. The noble form and fine features of Ravenswood, fired with the pride of birth and sense of internal dignity, the mellow and expressive tones of his voice, the desolate state of his fortunes, and the indifference with which he seemed to endure and to dare the worst that might befall, rendered him a dangerous object of contemplation for a maiden already too much disposed to dwell upon recollections connected with him. When their eyes encountered each other, both blushed deeply, conscious of some strong internal emotion, and shunned again to meet each other's looks. Sir William Ashton had, of course, closely watched the expression of their countenances. "I need fear," said he internally, "neither parliament nor protestation. I have an effectual mode of reconciling myself with this hot-tempered young fellow, in case he shall become formidable. The present object is, at all events, to avoid committing ourselves. The hook is fixed. We will not strain the line too soon. It is as well to reserve the privilege of slipping it loose, if we do not find the fish worth landing." In this selfish and cruel calculation upon the supposed attachment of Ravenswood to Lucy, he was so far from considering the pain he might give to the former by thus dallying with his affections, that he even did not think upon the risk of involving his own daughter in the perils of an unfortunate passion, as if her predilection, which could not escape his attention, were like the flame of a taper, which might be lighted or extinguished at pleasure. But Providence had prepared a dreadful requital for this keen observer of human passions, who had spent his life in securing advantages to himself by artfully working upon the passions of others. Caleb Balderstone now came to announce that breakfast was prepared, for in those days of substantial feeding, the relics of the supper simply furnished forth the morning meal. Neither did he forget to present to the Lord Keeper, with great reverence, a morning draught in a large pewter cup garnished with leaves of parsley and scurvy grass. He craved pardon, of course, for having omitted to serve it in the great silver standing cup, as behoved, being that it was at present in a silversmith's in Edinburgh, for the purpose of being overlaid with gilt. "In Edinburgh like enough," said Ravenswood, "but in what place, or for what purpose, I am afraid neither you nor I know." "Ah, weel," said Caleb peevishly, "there's a man standing at the gate already this morning. That's aething that I ken. Does your honour ken whether ye will speak wi' him or no?" "Does he wish to speak with me, Caleb?" "Less will no serve him," said Caleb; "but ye had best take a vissy of him through the wicket before opening the gate. It's no every yin we should let into this castle." "What! Do you suppose him to be a messenger come to arrest me for debt?" said Ravenswood. "A messenger arrest your honour for debt? and in your castle of Wolf's Crag. Your honour is jesting with auld Caleb this morning." However, he whispered in his ear as he followed him out, "I would be loath to do ony decent man a prejudice in your honour's good opinion, but I would tak twa looks at that child before I let him within these walls." He was not an officer of the law, however, being no less a person than Captain Craigengelt, with his nose as red as a comfortable cup of brandy could make it, his laced cocked hat set a little aside upon the top of his black riding periwig, a sword by his side, and pistols at his holsters, and his person arrayed in a riding suit laid over with tarnished lace, the very moral of one who would say, "Stand to a true man." When the Master had recognised him, he ordered the gates to be opened. "I suppose," he said, "Captain Craigengelt, there are no such weighty matters betwixt you and me, but may be discussed in this place. I have company in the castle at present, and the terms upon which we last parted must excuse my asking you to make part of them." Craigengelt, although possessing the very perfection of impudence, was somewhat abashed by this unfavourable reception. He had no intention, he said, to force himself upon the Master of Ravenswood's hospitality. He was in the honourable service of bearing a message to him from a friend, otherwise the Master of Ravenswood should not have had reason to complain of this intrusion. "Let it be short, sir," said the Master, "for that will be the best apology. Who is the gentleman who is so fortunate as to have your services as a messenger?" "My friend, Mr. Hayston of Bucklaw," answered Craigengelt, with conscious importance, and that confidence which the acknowledged courage of his principal inspired, "who conceives himself to have been treated by you with something much short of the respect which he had reason to demand, and therefore is resolved to exact satisfaction. I bring with me," said he, taking a piece of paper out of his pocket, "the precise length of his sword, and he requests you will meet him, accompanied by a friend and equally armed, at any place within a mile of the castle, when I shall give attendance as umpire or second on his behoof." "Satisfaction and equal arms!" repeated Ravenswood, who, the reader will recollect, had no reason to suppose he had given the slightest offence to his late intimate. "Upon my word, Captain Craigengelt, either you have invented the most improbable falsehood that ever came into the mind of such a person, or your morning draught has been somewhat of the strongest. What could persuade Bucklaw to send me such a message?" "For that, sir," replied Craigengelt, "I am desired to refer you to what, in duty to my friend, I am to term your inhospitality, in excluding him from your house, without reasons assigned." "It is impossible," replied the Master. "He cannot be such a fool as to interpret actual necessity as an insult. Nor do I believe that, knowing my opinion of you, Captain, he would have employed the services of so slight and inconsiderable a person as yourself upon such an errand, as I certainly could expect no man of honour to act with you in the office of umpire." "I, slight and inconsiderable!" said Craigengelt, raising his voice, and laying his hand on his cutlass. "If it were not that the quarrel of my friend craves the precedence, and is in dependence before my own, I would give you to understand—" "I can understand nothing upon your explanation, Captain Craigengelt. Be satisfied of that, and oblige me with your departure." "D—n," muttered the bully. "And is this the answer which I am to carry back to an honourable message?" "Tell the Laird of Bucklaw," answered Ravenswood, "if you are really sent by him, that, when he sends me his cause of grievance by a person fitting to carry such an errand betwixt him and me, I will either explain it or maintain it." "Then, master, you will at least cause to be returned to Hayston by my hands his property, which is remaining in your possession." "Whatever property Bucklaw may have left behind him, sir," replied the Master, "shall be returned to him by my servant, as you do not show me any credentials from him which entitle you to receive it." "Well, master," said Captain Craigengelt with malice which even his fear of the consequences could not suppress. "You have this morning done me an egregious wrong and dishonour, but far more to yourself. A castle, indeed!" he continued, looking around him. "Why, this is worse than a cook gorge house, where they receive travellers to plunder them of their property." "You insolent rascal!" said the master, raising his cane, and making a grasp at the captain's bridle. "If you do not depart without uttering another syllable, I will batoon you to death." At the motion of the master towards him, the bully turned so rapidly round that with some difficulty he escaped throwing down his horse, whose hoofs struck fire from the rocky pavement in every direction. Recovering him, however, with the bridle, he pushed for the gate, and rode sharply back again in the direction of the village. As Ravenswood turned around to leave the courtyard after this dialogue, he found that the Lord Keeper had descended from the hall, and witnessed, though at the distance prescribed by politeness, his interview with Craigengelt. "I have seen," said the Lord Keeper, "that gentleman's face, and at no great distance of time. His name is Craig something, is it not?" "Craigengelt is the fellow's name," said the master, "at least that by which he passes at present." "Craig in gilt," said Caleb, pruning upon the word Craig, which in Scotch signifies throat. "If he is Craig in gilt just now, he is as likely to be Craig in peril as ony chiel I ever saw. The loon has Woody written on his very visnomy, and I would wager twa and a plack that hemp plaits his cravat yet." "You understand physiognomy, good Mr. Caleb," said the keeper, smiling. "I assure you the gentleman has been near such a consummation before now, for I most distinctly recollect that upon occasion of a journey which I made about a fortnight ago to Edinburgh, I saw Mr. Craigengelt, or whatever is his name, undergo a severe examination before the Privy Council." "Upon what account?" said the Master of Ravenswood, with some interest. The question led immediately to a tale which the Lord Keeper had been very anxious to introduce, when he could find a graceful and fitting opportunity. He took hold of the Master's arm, and led him back towards the hall. "The answer to your question," he said, "though it is a ridiculous business, is only fit for your own ear." As they entered the hall, he again took the Master apart into one of the recesses of the window, where it will be easily believed that Miss Ashton did not venture again to intrude upon their conference. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of The Bride of Lammermoor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Henry. The Bride of Lammermoor by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 17. Here is a father now will truck his daughter for a foreign venture, make her the stopgap to some cankered feud, or fling her o'er, like Jonah to the fishes, to appease the sea at highest. Anonymous. The Lord Keeper opened his discourse with an appearance of unconcern, marking, however, very carefully the effect of his communication upon young Ravenswood. "You are aware," he said, "my young friend, that suspicion is the natural vice of our unsettled times, and exposes the best and wisest of us to the imposition of artful rascals. If I had been disposed to listen to such the other day, or even if I had been the wily politician which you have been taught to believe me, you, Master of Ravenswood, instead of being at freedom, and with full liberty to solicit and act against me as you please, in defence of what you suppose to be your rights, would have been in the castle of Edinburgh or some other state prison, or if you had escaped that destiny, it must have been by flight to a foreign country, and at the risk of a sentence of fugitation." "My Lord Keeper," said the Master, "I think you would not jest on such a subject, yet it seems impossible you can be in earnest." Innocence, said the Lord Keeper, is also confident, and sometimes, though very excusably, presumptuously so. I do not understand, said Ravenswood, how a consciousness of innocence can be in any case accounted presumptuous. Imprudent, at least, it may be called, said Sir William Ashton, since it is apt to lead us into the mistake of supposing that sufficiently evident to others, of which, in fact, we are only conscious ourselves. I have known a rogue, for this very reason, make a better defence than an innocent man could have done in the same circumstances of suspicion. Having no consciousness of innocence to support him, such a fellow applies himself to all the advantages which the law will afford him, and sometimes, if his counsel be men of talent, succeeds in compelling his judges to receive him as innocent. I remember the celebrated case of Sir Cooley Condiddle of Condiddle, who was tried for theft under trust, of which all the world knew him guilty, and yet was not only acquitted, but lived to sit in judgment on honester folk. Allow me to beg you will return to the point, said the Master. You seemed to say that I had suffered under some suspicion. Suspicion, Master, ay, truly, and I can show you the proofs of it, if I happen only to have them with me. Here, Lockhart. His attendant came. Fetch me the little private mail with the padlocks, that I recommended to your particular charge, d'ye hear? Yes, my lord. Lockhart vanished, and the keeper continued, as if half speaking to himself. I think the papers are with me. I think so, for, as I was to be in this country, it was natural for me to bring them with me. I have them, however, at Ravenswood Castle, that I am sure, so perhaps you might condescend. Here Lockhart entered, and put the leathern scrutoire, or mail-box, into his hands. The keeper produced one or two papers, respecting the information laid before the Privy Council concerning the riot, as it was termed, at the funeral of Alan Lord Ravenswood, and the active share he had himself taken in quashing the proceedings against the Master. These documents had been selected with care, so as to irritate the natural curiosity of Ravenswood upon such a subject, without gratifying it, yet to show that Sir William Ashton had acted upon that trying occasion the part of an advocate and peacemaker betwixt him and the jealous authorities of the day. Having furnished his host with such subjects for examination, the Lord Keeper went to the breakfast table, and entered into light conversation, addressed partly to old Caleb, whose resentment against the usurper of the castle of Ravenswood began to be softened by his familiarity, and partly to his daughter. After perusing these papers, the Master of Ravenswood remained for a minute or two with his hand pressed against his brow, in deep and profound meditation. He then again ran his eye hastily over the papers, as if desirous of discovering in them some deep purpose, or some mark of fabrication, which had escaped him at first perusal. Apparently the second reading confirmed the opinion which had pressed upon him at the first, for he started from the stone bench on which he was sitting, and going to the Lord Keeper, took his hand, and strongly pressing it, asked his pardon repeatedly for the injustice he had done him, when it appeared he was experiencing at his hands the benefit of protection to his person and vindication to his character. The statesman received these acknowledgments at first with well-feigned surprise, and then with an affectation of frank cordiality. The tears began already to start from Lucy's blue eyes at viewing this unexpected and moving scene. To see the Master, late so haughty and reserved, and whom she had always supposed the injured person, supplicating her father for forgiveness, was a change at once surprising, flattering, and affecting. "Dry your eyes, Lucy," said her father. "Why should you weep? Because your father, though a lawyer, is discovered to be a fair and honourable man. What have you to thank me for, my dear master," he continued, addressing Ravenswood, "that you would not have done in my case? Suum cuique tribuito was the Roman justice, and I learned it when I studied Justinian. Besides, have you not overpaid me 1,000 times in saving the life of this dear child?" "Yes, answered the master, in all the remorse of self-accusation, but the little service I did was an act of mere brutal instinct. Your defence of my cause, when you knew how ill I thought of you, and how much I was disposed to be your enemy, was an act of generous, manly, and considerate wisdom." "Pshaw!" said the Lord Keeper, "each of us acted in his own way, you as a gallant soldier, I as an upright judge and privy councillor. We could not, perhaps, have changed parts. At least, I should have made a very sorry Toreador, and you, my good master, though your cause is so excellent, might have pleaded it perhaps worse yourself than I who acted for you before the council." "My generous friend," said Ravenswood; and with that brief word, which the keeper had often lavished upon him, but which he himself now pronounced for the first time, he gave to his feudal enemy the full confidence of a haughty but honourable heart. The master had been remarked among his contemporaries for sense and acuteness, as well as for his reserved, pertinacious, and irascible character. His prepossessions accordingly, however obstinate, were of a nature to give way before love and gratitude, and the real charms of the daughter, joined to the supposed services of the father, cancelled in his memory the vows of vengeance which he had taken so deeply on the eve of his father's funeral. But they had been heard and registered in the book of fate. Caleb was present at this extraordinary scene, and he could conceive no other reason for a proceeding so extraordinary than an alliance betwixt the houses, and Ravenswood Castle assigned for the young lady's dowry. As for Lucy, when Ravenswood uttered the most passionate excuses for his ungrateful negligence, she could but smile through her tears, and as she abandoned her hand to him, assure him, in broken accents, of the delight with which she beheld the complete reconciliation between her father and her deliverer. Even the statesman was moved and affected by the fiery, unreserved, and generous self-abandonment with which the Master of Ravenswood renounced his feudal enmity, and threw himself without hesitation upon his forgiveness. His eyes glistened as he looked upon a couple who were obviously becoming attached, and who seemed made for each other. He thought how high the proud and chivalrous character of Ravenswood might rise under many circumstances in which he found himself overcrowed, to use a phrase of Spenser, and kept under by his brief pedigree and timidity of disposition. Then his daughter, his favourite child, his constant playmate, seemed formed to live happy in a union with such a commanding spirit as Ravenswood, and even the fine, delicate, fragile form of Lucy Ashton seemed to require the support of the master's muscular strength and masculine character. And it was not merely during a few minutes that Sir William Ashton looked upon their marriage as a probable and even desirable event, for a full hour intervened ere his imagination was crossed by a recollection of the master's poverty and the sure displeasure of Lady Ashton. It is certain that the very unusual flow of kindly feeling with which the Lord Keeper had been thus surprised was one of the circumstances which gave much tacit encouragement to the attachment between the master and his daughter, and led both the lovers distinctly to believe that it was a connection which would be most agreeable to him. He himself was supposed to have admitted this in effect, when, long after the catastrophe of their love, he used to warn his hearers against permitting their feelings to obtain an ascendancy over their judgment, and affirm that the greatest misfortune of his life was owing to a very temporary predominance of sensibility over self-interest. It must be owned, if such was the case, he was long and severely punished for an offence of very brief duration. After some pause, the Lord Keeper resumed the conversation. "In your surprise at finding me an honester man than you expected, you have lost your curiosity about this Crakengelt, my good master. And yet your name was brought in the course of that matter too." "The scoundrel!" said Ravenswood. "My connection with him was of the most temporary nature possible, and yet I was very foolish to hold any communication with him at all. What did he say of me?" "Enough," said the keeper, to excite the very loyal terrors of some of our sages, who are for proceeding against men on the mere grounds of suspicion or mercenary information. Some nonsense about your proposing to enter into the service of France, or of the Pretender, I don't recollect which, but which the Marquis of A, one of your best friends, and another person, whom some call one of your worst and most interested enemies, could not, somehow, be brought to listen to. I am obliged to my honourable friend, and yet," shaking the Lord Keeper's hand, "and yet I am still more obliged to my honourable enemy." "Inimicus amicissimus," said the Lord Keeper, returning the pressure. "But this gentleman, this Mr. Haston of Bucklaw, I am afraid the poor young man, I heard the fellow mention his name, is under very bad guidance." "He is old enough to govern himself," answered the Master. "Old enough, perhaps, but scarce wise enough, if he has chosen this fellow for his fidus Achates. Why, he lodged an information against him; that is, such a consequence might have ensued from his examination, had we not looked rather at the character of the witness than the tenor of his evidence." "Mr. Haston of Bucklaw," said the Master, "is, I believe, a most honourable man, and capable of nothing that is mean or disgraceful." "Capable of much that is unreasonable, though; that you must needs allow, Master. Death will soon put him in possession of a fair estate, if he hath it not already. Old Lady Girnington, an excellent person, excepting that her inveterate ill nature rendered her intolerable to the whole world, is probably dead by this time. 6 heirs portioners have successively died to make her wealthy. I know the estates well. They match with my own, a noble property." "I am glad of it," said Ravenswood, "and should be more so, were I confident that Bucklaw would change his company and habits with his fortunes. This appearance of Craigengelt, acting in the capacity of his friend, is a most vile augury for his future respectability." "He is a bird of evil omen, to be sure," said the Keeper, "and croaks of jail and gallows tree. But I see Mr. Caleb grows impatient for our return to breakfast." Chapter 18